Hey everybody. Hey. Whoa. Sean, stop. You're hurting yourself. Sean. Oh, I lost you there for a minute.
Sorry, I got lost.
Oh yeah, you
were
in the music stabbing yourself.
Whoa.
Are you okay?
That was intense.
Do you need a doctor?
Oh man, we need a new theme song. That one's too powerful.
It's overwhelming us.
It's very
its
good.
Epicness.
Whoa! How do we get in here in the lore dump? This is insane. I didn't even know I was here. I was at home eating dinner.
Entered the dump zone.
Oh no! Audience, run very quickly.
All right.
Jesus Christ.
Right. So we're it's us, the lore dump. Hi everybody. We love you all so very much. Welcome in. So let's who are you, Sean?
Well, I think you just answered my question. I'm Sean.
Who are you?
Oh, I get it. You're an owl. Is that not the joke? Hi, I'm Mr. Chickadance, Sean for short. Or recently I've been dubbed the Governess. Nice to meet you.
Hey, the Governess. Oof.
That's my new title.
Love
Don't look at my eyes. I'll have you killed.
Off with that head.
I'm horrible.
And I am Josh, aka the Governor. And Sean and I do this podcast where we make lore. And if you're starting here, you're starting in the wrong place. You should go back to episode 1 of Lore Dump, because that's where all the juicy good stuff is. Now we're just rambling incoherently into microphones. Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We sort of just pick up from last session. We don't move for a week, and then we record the next one and put it out.
That's exactly it. We just sit stationary staring into each other's eyes. It's a weird sort of stasis.
You know what? To the audience of the Welcome In, they'd believe it.
They would.
Because we don't move ever.
The people who know us well are just like, oh, they're sitting in the same chair they're always sitting in, doing nothing. Yeah. I mean, we do stuff. Anyway, hey.
One of these days I'll see the sun. Hey, yeah.
Hey,
anyways,
Sean.
Hey, Josh, you tell me this. You tell me something now.
Oh,
hey, it's my turn to talk.
Okay.
It's your turn to answer. If the good people who listen to this want to ask us questions and send us stuff that we can help them make on the show, where would they go ahead and do that, Joshua?
Well, they would send those to loredumpquestions@gmail.com, where we have an army of hardworking individuals monitoring that email address at all times. Just a whole corporate entity, Fortune 500 group of people monitoring loredumpquestions@gmail.com. Or
you pay those squirrels very well.
Yes, they're very talented squirrels. It's incredible that they can use a keyboard that well. Or they can twit and or Instagram them at us at the lore dump. Right?
Yeah.
I got it wrong
Why are you
last
looking at
time
me like
and
that?
I was really worried.
At the lore dump. Yeah, you're right. On Instagram and Twitter.
Yeah, see, I did that. I totally knew. I got it wrong last time and you told me off, so I was just like, did I do it?
Well, that's because you've angered me, but not this time. This time you did good. I'm very proud of you.
I should probably write that Instagram and Twitter handle at the lore dump on our little sheet.
Or you could get it tattooed on yourself, listeners. So you never forget it.
They're gonna tattoo it on themselves?
It's a suggestion. They don't have to, but I'd appreciate it. They get 12 Sean points, and those can be redeemed anytime I choose.
Lore dump is not responsible for any tattoos that you give yourself.
I think that's implied.
I mean, you never know. Okay.
You never know what laws this asshole's going to come up with next. So what are we talking about today, Josh?
Well, what we're talking about today is there's this brewing conflict that's been a major part of our canon for quite a while. And it's been a really important part of Xander Hamilton's.
Excuse
me, Disney
don't say that name.
Xander Hamilton's lore and the First Continent's lore and the lore of the dwarfs and the city on the pillars. All of that is tied back to the first race of sentient creatures to populate Toreg, which was the Elves. And the Elves populated a continent that has yet to be defined. So do you know what we're doing this week, Sean? Can you guess, with all of those context clues that I've provided for you?
We're talking Shadowfell. No? I'm sorry. I zoned out there for
one more try. One more try.
All right, start from the top again.
No.
Fine. I guess I'm flying by the seat of my pants here. Second continent?
I know you listen to every word I say because I watch you gazing at me in rapt attention. But yes, you are correct. We're doing.
Oh wow,
we're
that was
doing,
lucky.
Yeah, good job.
Shot in the dark there.
Well guessed, sir. Well guessed. So we are doing the home continent of the elves, the kind of source of civilization to an extent on the planet of Toreg, which is
And also conflict.
and conflict. Yeah, and this is a pretty big deal. The elves are weird, right? Because they've seen the birth of the other races on this planet. They've seen Grieg making things come alive. They've seen the architect creating like the dwarves and then the other life on the planet. Like they've seen all of that happening.
Well, given the scale of everything, it wasn't necessarily the first ever elves that witnessed that stuff, but like their descendants.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. Absolutely, we're talking extensive timelines here. We're talking tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years.
So like 6 generations of elves.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
I mean, the funny thing with elves and some of the like long lifespan races is in regards to conflict and war, they don't live any longer. And that was something that Tolkien tended to play with, is like when there was war or conflict, the lifespans of elves were like not a lot longer than the other humanoid races because conflict begets death. And so there's periods where that war and conflict, and I think we touched upon this too, for some of the longer lifespan races, which also have longer periods to procreate a child.
Yeah, dude.
War and like mass scale death and plague can significantly hinder that civilization's growth, because could you imagine disease hitting a population that doesn't procreate as quickly as humans and wiping out a mass of the population?
I think that would be horrifying, but I also think that like elves overcome that stuff with being good with magic and in tune with nature, where they can more easily overcome those sort of obstacles instead of just pumping out more elves.
I mean, yeah, I but also that only works until you don't run into or that only works as long as you're not running into adversity that bypasses that, right? Like if you get a disease that you cannot cure, which like happens all the time. I mean, again, elves have a longer lifespan. I'm just saying that these things can.
It's not like we're going through anything right now in real life.
Yeah, it's not like this is an incredibly on the nose topic to be discussing.
Nothing comes to mind at the moment. As I stare at the same 4 walls.
He's been going crazy. He keeps sending me his hair.
I was just gonna let that hang.
I just blew out the microphone with my cackling. We're in a weird headspace today, guys. Okay, where are we gonna start with this creation?
Okay, Josh. Where do we start? Yeah, you're trying to pawn this off on me. No, where do we start, Josh? You're the anthropologist.
If this was a Hamilton reference, you would talk for 45 minutes.
I did last week. You get this one. I get Hamilton references, you get anthropology.
Okay. So let's start where many good tales start, at the
Caribbean.
Okay.
Yeah. The beginning. Go.
Touchdown.
Sorry.
What does it look like? What does it look like for these elves to get dumped on this planet? The god sweeps in and he says, "You are here as a parasitic life form to keep this egg from hatching." Obviously, he didn't say that because, God, could you imagine having that context? Your existence is just a...
I mean, so here's something we have to decide off the bat. Were they told this? Were they specifically, like, aware? Were they, like, the first and only race that was aware of their purpose here?
What if a sort of tribal or savage elves were the precursors? When they were put on this planet, and tribal does not equate savage, I'm just using those words to describe early elves as sort of very primal.
Cavemen.
Yeah, very primal individuals who developed civilization.
Okay. That's an interesting thought. Here is another thought for you. We have canonically established that nature didn't make it to this planet until this god splits and the nature god can come in and copy the Feywild.
Mm-hmm.
That is canonically how the world is sort of covered in this, verdant greens and
Correct.
stuff like that. So were they literally just standing on a barren wasteland?
I think probably there were like the necessities for life put on by the original god. But yeah, I think it was a horrific place to live for the early elves.
Yeah.
And I do
I
think
like
they
the
were
idea
very
for
like
that.
like maybe wood elves like harken their history back to early elves a lot closer than like the high elves and the more contemporary elven societies. Like it's very very early civilization, very you're making basic tools out of stone and that's really all you've got and searching for shelter and like nooks and crannies on this rough hewn surface. And really all you got
And
is water and air.
Ooh. And because they were designed to absorb the energy from this egg, they were very quickly able to sort of discover magic and make that a part of their lives.
Counterpoint, if there was no nature, no animals, no food, or no trees, there was no food, what if they were initially sustained solely by the magic of the egg?
That's also really cool.
So elves were literally, it's like that, it's where their inherent now magical capabilities come from. They find it very easy to tap into that arcane flow, but that's because that was their only source of sustenance initially, before the planet began to change. And then elves evolved over time as the planet began to change.
Yes, I very much like that idea.
That's cool.
As they sort of started to harness it, they began using it to develop more intricate society.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's good.
Ooh.
I like it's very akin to. I really love World of Warcraft's and Warcraft's world and lore building. Like the trolls were actually the like precursors to the elves, and the elves stumbled upon magically potent sources of arcane energy, which led their society to grow and from their bodies to change into more traditional kind of elves. So there's like I love stories like that where there's these legacies left behind by precursors. That's really cool.
I don't know what you just said, but it was something about World of Warcraft, I think.
Yeah, Sean blacked out and has just been staring into the void for the last 40 seconds because I said,
where'd all this blood come from?
hey, World of Warcraft. Yeah, I broke him.
Sorry, what just happened?
No, it's cool. It's good.
I'm lost now.
So we've got this like precursor elves. And so the water and the continents were initially carved, and these elves were just dropped onto this one continent, and everything else is just a big barren wasteland. And they have to ilk out a living, basically just rummaging around this wasteland, doing little more than siphoning arcane energy off of the planet.
Yes.
And they don't even really know this. Right? Like, they're just these creatures.
I would assume they don't even know this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I
then,
like to think that if the entity created these things, he did it with the purpose that, like, if they ever knew why they existed, they would fight back against that.
Yeah. When I think, like, they didn't even have, like, they didn't have language. Obviously, they didn't have writing. But because this god had, like, the concept of communication existed. So when he made them capable of it, and then they began to develop it of their own accord. Like it evolved and adapted.
I like that.
Yeah. So how long were they like this? How long were they alone on a barren rock?
They were alone for gosh, elves live so fucking dang long, don't they?
They do.
I'm gonna say for at least a few generations. Well, we really have to decide when that thing split.
Because they can live over 700 years. So
yeah, I feel like it was probably, relatively speaking, pretty close to when this individual made the elves. Is when he split himself.
I think we did say canonically that like he made them, and that was his last act. Like he was like, "Oh shit, this is gonna draw attention. I gotta split."
Yeah. So he made them, and then like maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years later, just sort of split himself off into different pieces.
Okay. So he made the elves. 3,000 or 4,000 years later, he splits himself off. The other entities begin to take an interest in what they want to do to Torek now that they exist. And maybe that's when the elves begin to adapt. The catalyst for them changing is that the world began to change because the gods changed.
Yes.
They didn't need to up until that time. They were kind of just content wandering around, siphoning energy and kind of chattering at each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then
somewhere in those 7,000 years, they didn't evolve much more than just the basic, like low-level thing that they were.
Yeah. You know, like they lived in caves. Maybe they gussied up the caves a little bit. Like, you know, they figured out that sort of thing.
So we have an individual that we've made canonical,
mm-hmm.
who in those 4,000 years falls into the other side before these other races come into being.
Well, now the elves are still on the planet, evolving even before the other. So, like there's still timeline to be played with after the 4,000 years, because the god splits, and the Feywild, you know, influences this other god, and they implement basic nature. But that doesn't mean the sentient races immediately hit the ground running. So there is also a window there for the elves to begin to develop. It could be 10,000 years of just the elves on this planet developing their own society. And it's where that inherent xenophobia comes from, to an extent. It was their planet for 10,000 years. That was it. Them and nature and these other things that were being seeded by the initial gods. And then the architect came into play, the one that began creating the other sentient races, because the balance was off.
Okay.
And
I like that.
As the elves developed, let's say 9,000 years into their history, or maybe like, so they're on the rock for 4,000 years. Nature happens. There's another 3,000 years. So 7,000 years into their history, this elf, who's relatively established, culture has begun to be defined, there's language, there's art, poofs himself into the other side. And when he comes back, elven society has changed drastically, but more importantly, there are all these other races on the planet now, because the gods have been dabbling. They've been tweaking and adjusting, and that has completely changed the surface of Torek.
What were they doing before anything else showed up? Like, after he split, we've got a rough 10,000 years for them to be alone.
I think really there are so for the first 4,000, when it's just a rock, I think they very much focused on language, because they didn't really have to worry about food or shelter. They had to worry about shelter, but they had that in the form of caves and things like that. They didn't have to worry about food because they had sustenance from the arcane flow, right? So that wasn't relevant. So they did like language, philosophy, like that came to them very early on.
Yes.
And when that's interesting. The fact that cognition and thought and deep levels of self-awareness came before basic tools, right? That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really good.
I like that.
So they were doing basic art with what they had, which was like stone on stone, but they were developing language. They were putting thought into their existence and the reason for life. And then nature hit. And then they were like, oh, we can do other things with this. This is neat. This is stuff we can play with. This is stuff we can do things with.
It wasn't even like that. It's like, oh, well, this stuff is all ours.
Yeah.
This is all stuff that we can do whatever we want to, because this is our planet and these things came to us.
Yeah.
And that's what caused that conflict between the nature god and these elves.
Yeah, because the nature gods were like, this, yeah, that's perfect. The elves were like, oh, cool. This is a thing that has happened for us. And they started dicking around with it.
Oh, neat. Toys. Yeah. Let's light them on fire. She's like, what?
And the nature god, excuse me? I put this here to make balance. And the balance just got worse. Which is why...
No. We can totally take these trees out of the ground and burn them to be warm when it's cold.
And we can build structures with them.
Yeah.
Ooh, and we could do other things with the stone. Ooh, and we could imbue them with magic. And the balance goes... And they start pulling more. And the balance goes further off kilter. And the
So it's
nature
just a
god
work
is
more to
like,
keep up
the
with it.
sentience screwed up my plan. And then the architect
Yeah.
is like, whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, we need to start doing something here to like dial
Yeah.
this in better. And at that point, the elves had like begun constructing cities because they were like the philosophy thing. They had established their culture and society so well already. There was organization to it. They hit the ground running fast when resources became available.
Yeah. They were just sitting there waiting for something to occupy their time.
Mm-hmm.
And then nature rolled up and was like, hi, waste your time on me.
And they're like, all right.
Yeah.
That's so good. That's so juicy.
It's very good and it fits.
Yeah.
The best part.
Oh, man.
Now, here's my question. Wood elves.
Yeah.
What if they're like almost like a sect of elves? Like a religious sect that actually appreciate what they were given and like broke off to live amongst nature
I love
because
it.
they realized the gift they had been given was so,
It's perfect.
Yeah.
It's absolutely
so
perfect.
awesome.
I like
it.
So when nature was seeded, it was seeded all across the planet, but it was only
Seeded.
one puns. It was only, excuse me, one planet that was really, or one continent, excuse me, that was impacted like this initially.
Yes. Yeah. At a time, basically. They focused on one.
Yeah.
One that had living creatures on it.
And so the elves, and like we can explain the other factions, like, we had already established that the Feywild and the Shadowfell and all that already exist outside of this, like the Abyss and all that as well. So the other variants of elves came into existence by interacting with those planes and through messing around with the inherent magic that comes from Toreg, yeeted themselves into those spaces, which created the Shadar-kai and the Eladrin, and right? Although I do think it's interesting that Eladrin are not primordial elves. Eladrin are after. It's what happened when a Toreg elf, a high elf, was sent to the Feywild.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. But
I
really
like
good.
that.
So all of our elf variants,
reverse.
yeah, it's inverse to a lot of the other stuff.
Yeah.
So, but on the planet itself, there were really the two factions are the high elves, the traditional elves, and the wood elves.
And that's what gives the high elves their like stuck up noses. Like, we were the first people here on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
And we deserve this planet because it's ours. And you guys all came here and ruined it.
And the wood elves were like, no, this is kind of a gift and we need to protect it.
Yeah.
And the nature god is like, I don't want you guys really, but it's better than cutting the trees down, so whatever.
Yeah, I'll put you to work.
Fine. You can help me maintain the balance.
Whatever, I guess. Go
Ambivalently.
look at those pigs or something.
Yeah. Very irritated about the whole thing, but it's perfect. God, this is so good. I adore this.
I like it.
It's really
okay,
good.
Okay.
I like elves in this world.
I guess
rarely
the
like
elves
I
are
like them in this world.
more specifically what this episode is about so far.
Yes.
We should retitle the elves. So
right.
what is the continent though?
So
because we've touched a lot about how it sort of affects the elves and they are a big part of what happens here. But what are the actual traits of the continent itself?
That's a really good question. I think... Oh, that's interesting.
Take your time. You can cut it out if we need to.
They have... So our other continent was kind of this original god lumping it together. And this, like, we really did define this as the continent of the elves. So, like, I'm good starting elves first. I think there was less of a plan to this. I think it's more of a, like, random landmass. But it's in a very temperate spot. So when he created it, he wasn't really thinking about putting sentient life. Or they weren't really thinking about putting sentient life on the planet. But then when they did, they were like, this seems pretty good, like in regards to the shape of this continent. Like it's jungles and woodlands and highlands. There's not a lot of cold, like it's faces the sun most of the year, like there's warmth there. It's a very... Or, I mean, I know the nature of it all really isn't... It needs to be related to the current of magic from Tareg's center. It needs to be the most optimal point for those sentient lives to siphon energy. The ley lines are
Ooh,
strongest there.
what if there's a crack beneath this continent that was covered up by the debris? He sort of like tapped it on over like a small hairline crack that was forming.
So it's basically like a long,
pack that down.
it's a long like land mass that's kind of been lifted upwards.
Yeah, its random shape is based on the random nature of the crack that formed,
I like it.
and it's sort of spread out over it just in case it gets wider.
And maybe there is a huge, like there's mountain ranges on either side of this continent, and then in the center there's a huge river valley that's very like when it did get seeded with nature, it became very fertile, right?
And there is also an inherent sort of conflict there.
Yeah.
Because when he split, that information was lost. The gods don't even know there's a crack there. It is hidden beneath this continent that
It's a fissure.
could be explored.
Yeah.
And it's just weirdly very powerful. It's like the most probably powerful arcane ley line on the planet.
And it's like there's holes punched into it from the Underdark as well, right? Because they like, you know, the worms and the creatures tunneling through the Underdark have hit this thing, which also gives those creatures access to the surface, which perhaps is why the elves are far more militaristic, because they, residing there, were fighting with creatures from the Underdark from the get-go, because they found it much easier to get to the surface.
So let's take a pause real quick. Explain drow. What are drow to us?
They went down the fissure.
And they lived there.
Mm-hmm.
So like a sect of elves broke off from the original group of society and went to live in the fissure.
Yeah.
And then populated the rest of the Underdark from there.
Yeah.
I like it.
And that's really good. Like, it's not that this is an open fissure, like you said, like the continent's been placed over it, but it's that access is much easier. Naturally formed caves that have occurred when the elves started exploring, they found their way into the fissure, and from the fissure they found their way to the Underdark.
That is beautiful.
That is really cool. So it's these two mountains with this depression in the center where the earth that was initially piled up has begun to sink downwards into the fissure. And there's also potential there in the future. I don't think we say this happens now, but what if, as the earth begins to settle into the fissure over hundreds of thousands of years, eventually it gives and sinkholes are beginning to form and massive cracks are beginning to form in the center of the continent?
Yeah, that would be devastating.
Yeah. And maybe the elves are aware of this now, and it's why they began sending the dwarves out to colonize other spaces and continents.
I think if that sort of geological event starts to happen, it's also like releasing spurts of like magic surges, like random wild magic surges.
Yeah, right in.
Just sort of popping up all over.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. This land has been inhabited for so long and sits on such a dangerous part of the planet that it really is, there's some wear and tear there.
Yeah.
It's beautiful and pristine, but there are also, like you said, these surges of magic and sinkholes into the Underdark.
And giant creatures that are giant for no fucking reason. No one can tell why they're growing so big.
Mm-hmm. And things
like kaiju.
Yeah, and stomping around and like things coming up out of the Underdark. Like the elves have always had to contend with that, which is why, despite being very philosophical and creative, there's also a very combative side to them.
I love it.
That's really good. That's good.
I love it.
Good, juicy lore.
I love it. All right. First things first.
I'm the realist.
Do we want to dive into like the capital city, or do we just want to come up with more features of the continent?
Well, let's at least define. So we know the drow went into the Underdark. I think we can parse that out. That doesn't have to be a part of this conversation. When we build the Underdark out more, we can talk about what happened when the drow went down there. But I think we definitely need to talk about factions within the elves. So like you said, the wood elves went off. Where did they set up? Are they antagonistic towards the elves? What are their capitals like? Is there a single capital? Are there multiple capitals? And same for the high elves. I mean, again, a population that size, it may not just be one city. There could be 2 or 3 elvish nations that form a sort of triumvirate or an empire of sorts, right? And each one of those could have their own capital. That's what my mind always works on that scale, right?
I mean, it's a good scale. I like that thought process.
So maybe that's
So there's like a triad of capital cities almost.
yeah, and maybe
Like a trinity
yeah,
force.
yeah, a trinity. There's a triforce of elves.
Yeah.
There's a link.
The triad force.
This one.
Some of them live in the sea also.
Ooh, under the sea. So are the wood elves where are the wood elves? Like where are they in this context?
Where are the what?
Where are the wood elves on this continent?
I think the wood elves would or reside in those woodlands and jungles and things you mentioned before.
Mm-hmm. And are those just scattered across the continent, and the wood elves are less established nations and more nomadic entities traveling through those woodlands?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's a good idea.
I like it when we at least have like a nomadic people or a less settled people. It's not to say that they aren't like culturally well established and developed and civilized. It's just that they don't anchor themselves anywhere. They roam
They don't have
across
like a single spot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that.
We did that kind of with the Minotaurs a little bit too, but that's good. And then the High Elves, there's 3 main nations that form this trinity. And it's a big, long continent, and maybe those nations are just the north, the center, and the south, spanning across the entire
So those would be located very close to this fissure then.
across it. The fissure runs straight up the middle, and the continent runs over it. All of them reside, at least a portion of their lands, over the fissure.
Okay. Very interesting. I like that. That makes a lot of sense for why the elves have such powerful magic.
Yeah, they've got that inherent connection there, and they're all seated in those spaces. And then if you do have like unique like homebrew elves, or there's a weird elf, categorization in the books that you want to fit into a nation, you can use one of those nations, one of those. That's cool.
So, what rules these elves? What these 3 different societies? Is there a single unifying leadership? Or at least an idea?
Well, there's a number of ways to think about it. We could consider theology, like what is their perspective on gods, and is it a church state, or are they church states, or is there a church state of the 3, right? Or we could go completely differently and think of, like, is it an oligarchy or an autocracy or a monarchy or a democracy or an empire? Like, what are those?
Because my thought is it was originally an empire with a singular, like, grand emperor. Well, right on the other side. He vanished. And then those individual, like, locations became their own. They separated from each other, basically.
Essentially, the emperor was the one who went to the other side. The empire, the emperor of the grand empire of the elves, poofed, and the empire fell to infighting amongst his progeny and his advisors, and that's where those 3 nations manifested.
Like each like city, state, or whatever had its own course of action the second he disappeared from power.
Yeah.
There were people filling in that vacuum so quickly that they just all separate from each other.
I mean, hell, counterpoint, or not counterpoint, addition to this. What if the Drow, the early Drow, were also a part of that empire, and were a 4th faction that split?
And went to the Underdark.
And went further into the Underdark.
So those were the people that didn't fit with any of the 3 surface societies?
Essentially, because of the fissure, there were 3 nations on the surface with populations of wood elves modeled among them. And then there was a 4th nation in the fissure underneath them, with their lands claiming the fissure. And when it all fell apart, those elves isolated and then began exploring the Underdark and became contemporary Drow.
Interesting. Okay. I like that.
I mean, like at this point, all five factions, because you've got three elven nations just branching off from the Empire, plus the Wood Elves, plus the Drow. All of them are almost indistinguishable from one another. But as they split off, they become very distinct.
Yes. I like that. It also gets rid of that inherently evil version of the Drow, which I fucking hate.
Exactly. They are just a different society who have a different culture that is dictated.
They're almost victims.
Yeah, by living under the ground.
Yeah.
And
I like that.
I like the idea of maintaining the matriarchy of the Drow. Maybe that is an outcome of the Emperor. Maybe he was particularly cruel to the Drow. And when they said, when they initially broke away, right, they were like, never a male leader again. And for 20,000 years or whatever the timeline has been, they have maintained that as they lived under the Underdark.
And they didn't have like a single unifying ruler. They just had all these different houses.
Exactly. Yeah. Matriarchal houses like that the polar opposite of what they had.
Yeah.
Under the Empire of the Elves. This is so good. The Elves are so cool on our planet. I said this earlier, I genuinely don't usually roleplay Elves because I find it kind of like
boring.
Yeah, it's fantasy trope. And no, people want to play Elves. Awesome, great. I've seen it so many times that I'm not really interested in it. I would play an elf in this world. That sounds fascinating to me.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah. Is there anything else we want to define about this place? We've got the geography. We've got the political structure. So the dwarves eventually were seeded onto this continent. Were any other races seeded onto this continent, or were they all put elsewhere? I guess we should define that. That's an important part of history.
I don't think they were put elsewhere because the dwarves had to come from here to find the other place.
The dwarves for sure, but what about like as the other races were, like the humans and
well, we've seen what tieflings are. They weren't created by anyone in particular.
Right. That was a later outcome.
They weren't crafted, which is probably why people trust them so little.
Yeah.
Minotaurs
were on the other continent.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about that much yet, but they were on the other continent. We've got gnomes and halflings together on the other continent as well.
There, yeah.
Humans. We never really got to how humans came up.
I think they were the architects' last attempt at balance, and they actually worked.
Because they could be like self-regulated to such a degree that it didn't really matter.
Yeah, and with the god of death and war, the twins coming into it, the humans really particularly like leaned hard into that, and it began to counterbalance itself with short lifespans and conflict being constant.
Yeah.
It was really easy to turn the tap with the humans.
Yeah, that was their sort of like grand finale.
Yeah. And I think that was probably maybe the Tiefling continent as well is where humans first set foot.
Here's an idea, and this goes back to like original D&D, old as shit days. Orcs.
Grimish and all that. War.
Yeah. What if they had a place on this continent? As like, not like they were the warfaring race.
Yeah.
But the elves looked down on them, particularly because they looked so monstrous with such disdain that it caused their conflict.
Okay.
I love the elves being at fault because I fucking hate elves.
Everything's the elves' fault.
Yeah.
So where were the orcs? Were they on their own landmass when they were placed, or were they on the elven continent?
I mean, I don't know. Maybe they were like a nomadic sort of like seafaring people like Vikings. I think they're cool like Vikings.
Yeah. They like manifested on a small. They were one of the ones, and I think maybe orcs and humans were kind of the same, where the architect put them on a very small island at sea.
A trial run.
And then they found their way off on their own.
Yeah.
And got everywhere. They just got into everything. The orcs and the
Yeah.
humans were particularly bad about just rapidly expanding outwards. And when the elves did come into contact with them, they're like, "The fuck? What is this?" And particularly the orcs.
I think orcs probably reproduce faster than humans
I think so, yeah.
because they reach maturity faster and they live less.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean,
Because I think originally they were made to be like literally warriors.
yeah, lore-wise,
for like wars.
yeah, they're meant to fight and die.
You okay?
Yeah, just got the hiccups.
Want to take a break?
No, I'm good.
Want to take a 5-minute break?
I'm good. Okay, that is so good. Okay, so we kind of have a few of the other like precursor races. The elves are coming into conflict with all of these. They're aware of the fissure. They're now aware that over, the last 6,000 years or whatever, the drow have begun to manifest beneath them, and they're becoming more and more at conflict with each other.
Not just beneath them, but have literally taken
Expanded
the
outwards.
ground beneath their feet.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, I meant it literally. Like, they're underneath them. There is an entire nation of hostile, or possibly hostile beings. There are all these other races beginning to manifest. They've got the dwarves. They've got the dwarves under their thumb, and they go, "Okay, you're hardy." All of these other folks are beginning to encroach upon what once was just our planet, but now they're actually encroaching upon our continent. You are going to go find us more land. We want to be proactive and find out what's out there. So the dwarves get to do it. And then the dwarves go out and go, "Well, fuck, we don't need the elves.
This land's awesome. We're going to stay here. It's like, no. Hang on.
That's for us."
Like, no, we're good.
No,
we're going
bye.
to stay here. Thanks,
Yep.
elves. You can have our land, our old busted up land that we don't want anymore.
And
We don't want
then,
mountains. Fuck.
then the war happens.
Yeah,
Oh, this is so rich. There's so much history
I do
here.
like that. That's very good
It's
stuff.
so good. Okay.
And all of it's so juicy. You could sink your teeth into it and you'd get a big mouthful of lore.
So good. Okay. All right. I've said this before, but I'll say it one more time. Are we missing anything else? I'm sure
I
there'll be
don't
things.
think. If we're missing anything, feel free to email us at loredumpquestions@gmail.com or at the lore dump at Instagram and Twitter.
Yes, agreed. I have one more thing to say because you can't stop my brain. I like to think that the elves are fairly agnostic.
They don't believe in a god?
They don't care that there's gods.
That's fair. I like that too.
Like they know there's gods. They've seen what the gods do to this planet. But they're like, well, this is our planet. You're just things up in space who keep adding things to the planet. You're an ends to a mean. If I need to call upon a god to an ends to a mean or worship a god for a certain thing, but generally speaking, culturally at least, they're fairly agnostic. They're like, it's irrelevant to our society. The gods do not dictate what we think. We were the original philosophers. We don't need them. We only need them if we need to call upon a specific magic, right? And they kind of are a little standoffish with the gods.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that really ties that up in a neat bow. Like, it aligns with their ancestry.
And their personality.
Yeah, and their personality. All right. It still leaves room for there to be paladins as elves, right? Like, we don't want to take that away from people.
Yeah, you can. I mean, everyone can change their own personal
Yeah.
opinion, but this is just broad society.
And it's not that they are atheists. They know the gods are there. They just,
Yeah. Well, it's very hard to have an atheist in a world where clerics have magical spells.
yeah. There's no atheists in D&D. Well, that would be funny to play an atheist in D&D, but
You're just a sorcerer. I'm not buying it. That'd actually be really funny.
oh my god. Anyway, okay. I think we've got it. I'm sorry. You tied it up and closed out this episode, like this lore section, so well, and then I was like, wait.
One more thing.
One more thing.
They don't like religion. It's like, okay, well,
Jeez, Josh.
we ended it there.
Jeez.
Ooh, am I sweating?
So, that means it's question time, Sean.
Is it
It is question time.
already?
Yeah, and
Here's the mail, it never fails. It makes me want to wag my tail. Questions. Oh,
Oh my You deep cut a Blue's Clues reference into the show, and then
That's a deep cut. That's a deep cut for you. That's Blue's Clues. How dare you?
I hate to date myself here, but I'm a little old for Blue's Clues.
Well, don't date yourself. Your wife and I are gonna get jealous.
Ooh, Josh. Oh, boo! Okay, question time.
Question time.
Question time. Okay, so we have a question, Sean. It's a good question. It's from a good friend of ours. It's from Lacey, certifiable nerd. Yes, member of the Twee community, all-around good person, D&D content creator.
What did Lacey ask us, Josh?
Okay. Lacey said, "Hey, at the Lordum," because they tweeted it to us and they're amazing. "I really, really want to put a recurring travel salesman in my campaign. How do I create someone like this in a way that doesn't break the magic within the world or make the party think this dude is following them?" That's actually a really good point. Like, sometimes I put reoccurring characters in a world and the party gets real suspicious. They're like, this dude's sus.
Yeah, he plays Among Us.
He plays Among Us.
He didn't do wires. I saw him do wires, but the bar didn't move.
Yeah, that's pretty
Also,
sus.
he tried to sell me a broken magic item. I think he's sus. That's all I'm saying. I'm voting him out.
This is a really good question. I'm going to ask it one more time. "Hey, at the Lordum, I really, really want to put a recurring travel salesman in my campaign. How do I create someone like this in a way that doesn't break the magic within the world or make the party think this dude is following them?"
Here's my answer. Maybe they are following them. Why can't they be following them? I think that'd be delightful. Like, maybe this is a store owner who has like a traveling setup who just fangirls over them the first time they meet. And it's like, you guys are adventure. That's awesome. I'm going to follow you around and I'm going to like chronicle your story.
Their own traveling merchant.
Yeah. Literally, like a little, almost like a bard that follows them from town to town.
I love that. I mean, a lot of... So, you never know how a party's going to respond to a character. A lot of the time I put in this, like, cute, fun NPC, and they're like, this guy's a bad guy. And a lot of the time I put in this terrible human being who's an absolute monster, and they're like, we love this dude. And so then you have to dial out if you want to commit to them being like a betrayal or like okay, let's make them actually a friend of the party. So gauge your party's response to the NPC, because you can do things to make them likable, like giving them an accent. Anytime I give anything an accent, my party adopts it immediately.
I won't let them leave.
And they won't let them leave. That's a good way to do it. So in regards to like them being suspicious, things like that, where just pivoting on the fly, and like if it doesn't work the first time, add in another character that's a little bit different with a slightly different accent, and that's now your magical merchant instead of the bad dude, right? In regards to power, like not breaking magic, I mean, you could give the NPC magical items that allow them to move around. You could give the NPC a chain of stores that are accessible in most towns and locations that are visited. Like, if you don't want the NPC to follow them around, you could have the NPC teleport around of their own accord. Maybe NPC shopkeep is pretty magically powerful. Like, Gilmore is like that. Gilmore was just a badass. Like, he was competent in and of himself. For those of you who don't know, Gilmore was a shopkeeper in Critical Role Campaign 1, right? And he had access to things to get him around.
I just came up with a great idea from Campaign 2 of Critical Role.
Yes.
Pumat's Soul. He can have different simulacrums manning his different stores around the continent.
He really could. Absolutely.
So you can go into the store, see the same person, almost like Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny from Pokemon.
Yeah.
Just like, weren't you over...
Actually, this has to exist in our world. We're going to do this. Sorry, Lacey, we're doing this because this is so good. There's a merchant who's got simulacrums to run his chains.
Yeah, but he has to basically make friends with powerful wizards to get different simulacrums, because one wizard can't make two simulacrums. Yeah. I've learned that the hard way. So he has to make friends with very powerful spellcasters. So it's a very connected individual.
Yeah, he knows lots of
people. Who basically runs this chain of stores across the nation.
And
I love that.
It's the same guy every time when you go in there.
Yeah, I mean, the simulacrums can be
right.
small variations of different, but for the most part, they're all the same dude.
Oh, that's so
Which
perfect.
is awesome, especially if the party loves it.
Yeah. That's so good. That's brilliant. So you could do that, Lacey.
There is also, I mean, let's not make this a Critical Role podcast, but there is also something that Matt Mercer is actively doing in this campaign, which I respect. He's putting a lot less magic stores in front of his party because it's the first question everyone asks the second they get to a new town. Where can we buy magic items, health potions, all that stuff? And he's like, there's a war going on. You can't. There's not a lot here. And there's like one store that does it in the entire continent.
Yeah.
Which is very fair and accurate.
And
so think about how prevalent you want magic items to be in your game, then tailor that NPC to that level of availability.
And that is like, I very much appreciate that. Like, I will usually put a magic shop in a town, but it has also a very limited inventory, right? Like, Seaton's a good example where you went there and there were like a specific set of things that they had collected. Once you buy it, that's it. Like, there's not more restocking that space. So,
unless it's like months and months later, they find new antiquities at different auctions or something like that.
Yeah.
One that's shipping a bottle.
Saltmarsh does a really good job of their magic salesperson in that scenario is a merchant from a far off land that is a antiquities trader, and they set up these little shops all over the place. And because they're a sailor who travels to collect the antiquities, it's very easy, as long as there's water access, which there is a lot of in Saltmarsh, for them to be at one store at one point and then at another store when the party gets there, because they've hopped on their sailing ship and they've went along. Like, their paths can cross organically that way as well.
Yeah.
That also, there's a mechanic in there that allows them to very quickly refresh their inventory, because Saltmarsh throws a lot of gold around in that scenario. So they want you to be able to spend it and use it. But that's the opposite of the Matt Mercer effect. I really like limited item access. I like putting it as rewards in dungeons or to be found or given.
Yeah. It's way more rewarding when it's found as opposed to purchased, I think.
Yeah. Purchasing is a mechanic to allow for player selection, when you want a player to be able to pick or a player to spend the gold that they've accrued.
Or you treat it as like, they didn't go explore that room, but they should really have this item.
Yeah.
It'll show up the next time they're in the store.
Yeah. That's all the time.
Almost like Destiny, when you forget to get the Ingrams and they show like, hey, you missed these, and it drops them all out.
And I will say with merchants, a lot of the time, again, merchants are there for the players to spend gold. Find a better way for your players to spend the gold. Give them a ship. Give them a home. Give them people they need to protect or pay.
Business.
Yes.
The business will run them dry in days.
So quickly. Give them a tavern. Taverns are like that's a huge part of so many scenarios. Like, give them something to spend their money on that isn't magical items. Magical items can happen other ways too. So that's another thing to consider. And there's so many ways to do this, and none of them are wrong. That was such a fun question. Any other thoughts?
That was a really great question.
That was a great question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No. I think that's perfect. Yeah, there's a lot of really fun ways just to do, like, if you want them to be traveling too, that's another thing. It doesn't have to be like a set store where they magically get to the store every time. There are a lot of different ways to just have them be a magical person and not have the party question it, because you'd be surprised how little people question magical abilities in a D&D environment. You can just say, like, they close the curtain and all of a sudden the cart, folds up into a little tiny card, and then the card burns up into ash and it's gone.
My personal favorite is the mask guy from Majora's Mask in the Zelda's games, where it's a merchant with a giant backpack that is loaded impossibly high, and they just constantly seem to run into him, like, going the opposite direction on the road. And he's always got stuff. He's always got stuff.
Yeah.
Like,
I love that kind of shit.
It's the best. And they're like, what is this guy's deal? He never seems malicious. Try not to rip them off with a character like that, because if you do, they'll get antagonistic towards him and they'll try and mug him next time. So try and be fair with your prices. But yeah.
I really like the idea of, like, a masked collective of, like, merchants. They're like the masked merchants. But it's the same guy, just with a different mask on.
Every time. That's
so it's like this
creepy.
It's the guise of, like, a collection of different merchants and different people, but it's the same person every time with a different face. That they either will or won't know, depending on how you want to work that. Like each one has a different voice and a little bit different features. But I really like the idea of that.
It makes me think of this whole train of thought makes me think of the salesman from like Resident Evil. What are you buying? What are you selling? Like that guy is always in the most random places, standing there.
Well, it's also funny you bring up video games because when I played Skyrim, there was only one, maybe two people I ever went to sell things.
Yeah.
Always in Whiterun.
Yep. Cause you'd have wares.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's...
Well, yeah, I went to Dawnstar to steal all that guy's stuff from that bush, and I would sell it to people in Whiterun. Or back to them.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, either or. One of the two.
It's great. Great stuff.
Yeah. So merchants are fun. Like, you can do really neat things with them. There's so many options, Lacey. That was a really good question. Thank you for asking.
That was a fantastic question.
Oh, man. All right. So, I mean, if people have awesome questions like this question from Certifiable Nerd, the amazing Lacey, how do they get
that one came from Twitter?
Yeah.
That one came from Twitter, believe it or not.
Wow.
At the Lore Dump on Twitter. You can also do it on Instagram. Or at the Lore Dump, or loredumpquestions@gmail.com. There you go.
Such good addresses that we have.
Such good places to be.
And remember, it's all run by a squirrel army.
Yeah. Kind of like the remake of Willy Wonka, where they replaced the swans with
squirrels.
Little squirrels looking for acorns.
I want one, Daddy. Sorry.
Yeah, that movie exists.
It does. All right. Are we just gonna like end this one in awkward silence?
We're just gonna let it hang there on Willy Wonka and his sad movie for a while. You know that was Johnny Depp?
I am aware of that, yeah.
Can you believe that?
Yeah, honestly, actually, he's pretty good at that. Like, maybe good, maybe not good movies.
Boop-a-doo
boop, boop-a-doo boop, boop-a-doo boop, boop-a-doo. It's weirdly syncing up. Why is this happening?
It's our mashup album.
It's so good. 10 out of 10.
Find us on Spotify or SoundCloud. I'm a rapper named M. She Dancy.
What's my rapper name, Sean?
Notorious Whitey.
Wow. All right. Boop-a-doo boop, boop-a-doo boop.
We already cut.